Hi, this is crushchessy for LeggoPoker, making my first video, a 25 no-limit video on 4 tables. And I'm going to call the tables table number 1 in the upper left-hand corner, table number 2 in the upper right, table 3 in the lower left, and table 4 on the lower right. And I'm just going to kind of try to concentrate in this video, since it's a low-stakes video, on just kind of ABC type play, the fundamentals that I think are necessary to beat these stakes. On table number 1, right away, there's a hand, pocket fives, which we open from the cutoff. And we get called by the big blind. Now, I think on this flop, 994, it's important to continuation bet, because most people will call you with ace high, so you get value from that. You get value from lower pairs. You'll get value from 4x's, like if he's got an ace 4 suited or something like that. And you'll also protect your hand versus Broadway type hands that have 6 outs to beat you. On table number 4, we get a great flop for our queens. And I think here it's pretty important just to bet out for a couple of reasons. I think it's a mistake to try to play this too tricky, for instance, to go for a check raise or something like that. Because if you bet out here and the case queen is out, like let's say ace queen, king queen jack suited, you're probably going to get 3 streets of value against most people at these stakes, where if you check raise the flop, some people will just throw their hand away in that spot. So you'll get more action against those top pair type hands. You'll also get good action against any flush draw. You'll get good action against king jack. A lot of people will call you one time with a hand like ace 10 or king 10 or anything like that. Plus you give your opponents the opportunity to bluff. So if they just both have nothing, one of them has 6-7 suited and the other has ace deuce suited, you probably weren't going to win a lot of money anyways. So I think it's best just to bet right out and see what you get for action. And the turn card is obviously great. So I'm just going to go ahead and bet again. And I could bet more. If he were on a flush draw, for instance, I knew that for a fact, I probably would want to bet more there, but I'm not totally sure what he has, and I don't want to scare him off if he's got a queen or if he's willing to hero call me with a 10. And on the river, he's only got about $3 left, so obviously we're going to bet it and hope he gives it to us, but I guess he had some sort of misdraw or something like that. So in this video, what I wanted to do is sometimes we have interesting hands we can discuss. Other times there's just kind of a lull in the action and maybe 4 or 5 minutes go by without too many interesting hands. So I wanted to kind of share some ideas as to what I thought were some of the key ideas to beating these games. I think there's a lot of people out there who are doing a lot of good things, like they're visiting forums, reading books, maybe studying some training videos. And for whatever reason, they're just having a hard time beating these games. They're breaking even or slightly losing. And I wanted to discuss kind of what I think are some of the biggest challenges that people who are having a hard time with these games are facing, or some of the biggest mistakes I think that they're making. Just on table number 1, briefly, I folded pocket 3s in the cutoff. And the reason for that is that the opponent who opened is a short stack. He's only playing about half a stack. He opened to 3.5 big blinds. So both of those situations are unfavorable for calling with small pairs. And then additionally, when you're going to call with a small pair in that spot, you kind of always have to think about how many people are behind you and can squeeze, because that's another bad thing that can happen. So here there's 3 people behind me that can squeeze. So I feel pretty justified in just laying the small pair down there. So, yeah, one thing that I think a lot of people do at these stakes is I think they get too married to the top pair. Like, let's say, for instance, that they call a king-queen on the button versus an under-the-gun opener, and the flop comes something like queen-7 deuce. Well, in that situation, if the opponent bets into you on the flop, you're probably going to call there. If the opponent bets into you on a blank turn, you're probably going to call again. But when the opponent bets into you on a blank river, you need to be very careful. Just briefly, I wanted to discuss this situation on table 2 before getting back to that point I was making, which is an under the gun open. I have Jack 10 suited in the big blind. I think it's pretty important to just fold here. These sorts of hands play very poorly heads up out of position against early position openers. I would say at these stakes, your typical early position opener is going to have about a 10% opening range. So that's a very tight range. If the flop comes something like Jack 7 deuce or 10 7 deuce, what's typically going to happen is that if your hand is ahead, you're going to win one bet, if that. And if you're behind, like let's say on Jack 7 deuce, your opponent has an overpair or ace jack or king jack suited, you're typically going to lose at least two bets and very often three. So this sort of hand, it really needs position, I think, to play a little bit better. So I'm just going to go ahead and fold that. But getting back to the point I was making, there was an interesting video series by The End recently on this website where he talked about inflection points and how different players have different inflection points. And by inflection point, he meant the point in the hand where people reveal the true strength of their hand. And typically at these stakes, I found the most common inflection point to be on the river. And in that situation I was discussing earlier, where you have king queen on a queen 7 deuce flop and you get bet into 3 streets, it's very rare, if you call that third barrel, that your opponent will show a hand weaker than ace queen. So if you're just in the habit of always calling there with king queen or queen jack suited or queen 10 suited and always showing that hand down, that's something I think is going to cause your win rate to plummet in the long run. And I'm not saying you should never show that hand down. I mean, if there's a certain dynamic between you and another player where you feel that player is getting out of line against you, then definitely you're going to want to take some showdowns there just to, if nothing else, to get some information about what they're doing. But if they're just a kind of a standard player for the stakes, you're usually just best off just laying your hand down in that situation. Another situation that comes up a lot that I think hurts most people quite a bit is I think a lot of the regulars are calling too many 3-bets. And the main situation where I think most people would benefit from tightening up quite a bit would be, first of all, if you open under the gun in a 6-handed game and get 3-bet. Most people are 3-betting you very tight in that situation. I would say the average player is probably 3-betting you with about 3% of their range. So if you're up against that type of player, it's just going to be very hard to show a profit if you're calling a 3-bet. And against that type of player, you're probably best off just calling with queens or better. If they're a little looser, maybe you think that they're 3-betting 5% or 6%, then I think it would be fine to call with ace king and jacks as well. And there are some players who 3-bet very liberally in that situation. If you play enough with them, you'll figure out who they are. And certainly, you can call with a little wider range against those guys. But against most people, I think you should play very tight if you get 3-bet from after you open under the gun. Another leak I think I see a lot is people calling 3-bets with any pocket pair, especially small pairs. Just briefly on table 2, I think it's a pretty easy continuation bet with the king queen on ace 9-9, just because when he calls, you're open from that seat. His range is going to be a ton of pocket pairs that have you beat, and on the ace high flop, he should fold most of those. But yeah, I think it's a big mistake when people tend to call with a lot of 3-bets with a lot of small pairs, because the reason they're doing it is easily understandable. They feel that if they hit their set, they're going to have very good implied odds. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong with that strategy. I mean, the first thing, obviously, is they can miss their set, which is going to happen 90% of the time, or close to 90% of the time. The second thing that can happen is that they can flop their set and not get very much action. Like if the flop comes 7-3 deuce and they flop a set of threes, their opponent might have ace king and bet once and just give up. Or alternatively, the opponent might even check fold a flop once in a while. So you just get no action at all with your set. And the third thing that can go wrong is when you flop the set, typically you don't have a cinch hand, because if you get action from the opponent's typically going to have a draw, which has a pretty good chance of beating your set, or your opponent is going to have an overpair, which will have about a 10% chance of drawing out. So you're really not winning your opponent's entire stack in that case. Like if your edge on average is, let's say, 85 to 15, you're only winning 70% of his stack. For all those reasons, I don't think you should call too much with the small pairs when you get 3-bet. On table number 1, I opened with ace queen offsuit from the hijack and got 3-bet by the small blinds. So normally this would be a pretty easy fold, I think, but here the small blind seems like a much looser player. His VPIP is over 40%. Over a very brief sample size, his 3-bet is around 11%. It's not a lot to go on, but I kind of felt that this was probably a little weaker player, and I could get away with calling this 3-bet. The flop came very poorly for me, though, and the opponent ended up making a very large continuation bet. Not huge, I guess, but I decided not to mess with him in that case because I really didn't know enough about him. But if you're going to defend a small pair, I typically want about a 20-to-1 ratio between the effective stacks that are playing in the hand and the amount I have to call. So let's say, for instance, I open from the under the gun seat for 75 cents and I get raised to $2.50 by the button. I have to call an additional $1.75 to see the flop. So I'm going to want the effective stacks in that case to be about $35 for me to see the flop in that situation. And if the effective stacks aren't that high, then I'd really rather just fold. Now, there might be some cases where I don't need the effective stacks to be quite that high. And I think a pretty good example of where I wouldn't need the effective stacks to be that high would be if there was an opponent I had very good control over. So let's say, for instance, I had a good read that my opponent would just c-bet once with all of his overcard type hands and then just check folds the turn if he didn't have an overpair after that. Well, in that case, I might be willing to settle for something like 15-to-1 in that situation. But against most people who play a little bit better, I'd really rather have odds of around 20-to-1 in that spot. Another situation where I kind of feel like people are calling 3-bets too often is if they are out of position. So, for instance, if you open on the cutoff and the button calls, just in general, I don't think you should call very often in that spot. The main spot where I think you would be looking to call a 3-bet would be, A, if you open from fairly late position, like let's say cutoff or button, and B, if you're going to have position, which typically is going to mean one of the blinds 3-betting you. Most of the time in that case, if your opponents are reasonably competent, they're going to have a pretty wide range. I'd say most of the regulars are 3-betting you at least 9% or 10% in those spots. So I think it's fine to call 3-bets in that situation if you have a hand like a decent suited Broadway hand, a suited connector, if you have a hand like ace queen, if in some cases you have a hand like pocket eights, pocket nines, I tend to think those are okay as well. But when you're going to be out of position, I just don't think you should call very often in that particular spot. Another thing I see people doing a lot is I see people stacking off a lot with kind of marginal hands against solid players. For instance, let's say that you have a hand like ace queen and the flop comes something like queen 7-5 and there's 2 diamonds and you bet out on the flop and get raised. Now, here's where you really need to kind of figure out what sort of opponent you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a bad opponent, I mean one that plays very wide ranges, is overly aggressive. I mean, that can be a spot where you can and should easily stack off in a variety of ways. You could just call and sit there and collect bullets, or you can re-raise them right on the flop, because a lot of those players are prone to just getting it in with any top pair, like king queen in that spot, or queen jack or queen 10, and your ace queen will be in very good shape. But let's say you're against a solid regular in that spot. It's a guy who plays pretty tight pre-flop range, and he's definitely got the ability to make some moves, but he's not too crazy. If you're up against someone like that, and you get raised on the flop and call, and let's say the turn is a blank, and you get bet into again, and you call, and then the river's a blank as well, and he just bombs into you, just makes a huge bet. It seems to me like most of the regulars at these stakes are just routinely paying off that bet. And I think that that's a big mistake against most people, because, yeah, granted, a lot of the regulars can bluff raise with air, can bluff raise with draws, and a lot of the regulars can follow up on a turn as well. There's not too many regulars at this stake who, if they have air, can follow up with an all-in shove on the river. So you're just going to be best off just releasing your hand at that point against the great majority of people. And usually at these stakes, you just want to concentrate on A, B, C, solid type play. You don't want to get too carried away with huge hero calls because you thought you saw something there that didn't make sense, or something like that. And I mean, here's definitely a case where you should do as I say and not as I do, because I mean, I've made some pretty absurd calls in my time. But for the most part, the solid good regulars, or even just the solid average regulars, when they make huge bets, they've generally got what they're advertising in those spots. Some other things that I end up seeing sometimes is I think that some of the regulars are not 3-betting quite enough versus the late position opens and calling them a little too often. And I'll get back to that in a second, because we end up having a pretty interesting hand on table number 2 right here, where I've got the ace king. We actually end up having 2 interesting hands kind of simultaneously in just a second here. With the ace king, I open the cutoff. Get called by the big blind, and get what seems like a very good flop, king 8-6. And I bet out and get raised here. So here's an interesting spot to discuss. Because when my opponent raises in this spot, you can basically put his hands into 3 categories, I think. The first category are the monsters, which would be a set of 8s, a set of 6s, maybe 8-6 suited if it's in his range. The second category would just be air. Maybe he's got a hand like ace queen, and he's just taking a shot. Maybe he's got a hand like pocket 5s. He wants to see where he's at. Maybe he figures I have ace queen and I'll just throw my hand away. So the second category would be air hands. The third category would be decent made hands and draws. So that might be a hand like king queen, king jack, or a hand like king queen of diamonds, king jack of diamonds, king 10 of diamonds, or any other assorted flush or straight draws. So I think that against that entire range, it would be a mistake to re-raise here, because if I re-raise, he's going to throw away all of his air hands, and he'll shove with his sets and 2 pairs, and he'll shove with the better part of his draws. So if you look at the equity I'm going to get it in with, it's just not very good. And if he has air, I'd just kind of like to let that part of his range live so that I can collect some more bullets from that part of his range on the turn. So I end up just calling here. The turn is a complete blank. There's also a pretty interesting hand on table number 3, where I opened an ace-9 of clubs from the hijack seat and got called by the cutoff. The flop came ace-high, so I bet. and he called, and the turn came a queen. Now, this is a spot where I think most people don't really consider the positional dynamic at the table quite enough. For instance, let's say that I'm in the small blind and I open with this ace-9 of clubs and I get called by a big blind. And then I continuation bet that flop and get called. Well, in that case, my opponent could probably have any ace in his range, could probably have a lot of 10Xs, a lot of flush draws like 7-6 of diamonds, 8-6 of diamonds, really quite a few hands that I'm ahead of. So in that case, it would be fine to simply just bet again on the turn or just check call. There's a lot of ways I can handle the hand. But when you open in this spot from the hijack and get called from the cutoff, typically your opponent's range is quite a bit different. And in that situation, your opponent's range is mostly going to consist of pocket pairs, deuces through jacks, and some of the better broadways, especially the suited combinations. So when I continuation bet this flop and he ends up calling, very few of his hands are going to be 10x hands, like 10 jack, 10-9, 10 king. He'll rarely have those hands. And he's not going to have a flush draw particularly often either. So he's usually going to have a hand like ace-queen, ace-jack maybe. I mean, ace-jack suited would definitely be in his range. Ace-jack offsuit might or might not be. And sometimes he's going to have a set of 10s or a set of 5s. So I don't think there's really too much alternative for me on this turn other than to just go ahead and check fold. So that's what I did. Well, that's what I was going to do, I should say, but the hand played out a little bit differently. Getting back to the hand on table number 2, this is kind of an interesting spot because a total blank came on the turn, and he ended up betting again. And I think that kind of one mistake that people at these stakes make quite a bit is they really give a lot of information away from how they size the bet. Like, in this case, he only bet around half the pot, which ended up leaving me with close to $18 behind in a pot of around $15. So, in this situation, if he wanted to put me all in on the river, he would have to overbet the pot. And if he did have a set of 8s or a set of 6s, almost surely he would bet a little bit bigger on the turn, just so that on the river he could shove without it being an overbet. So I think his small turn bet is a pretty strong indication that he's got either king with a worse kicker than mine, or that he has some sort of drawing hand. And the river as well ends up being a blank on table number 2. On table number 3, I was going to check fold, but he bets so small. He bets about a quarter of the pot that getting 5-1, it's kind of hard to fold top pair. And then the river comes pretty interestingly on table number 3. I ended up making aces up. And now I decided to switch plans a little and decided to bet. Now, one of the first things you learn in poker when you decide to bet the river is you need to ask yourself, am I going to have the best hand more than half of the time that he calls? And if so, then it's okay to bet the river. But if not, you should check. But I think overall that analysis is a bit too simplistic. I think the correct way to analyze it is what decision is going to offer you the highest expected value. So let's say I end up checking here. Well, if I check and he ends up betting, I don't really think I can call because I'm not really going to be good very often. So I'd have to throw my hand away. Now, that means that occasionally, I don't think it would happen a lot, but once in a blue moon, he'd be bluffing me out with a hand like king queen or queen jack or jack 10 or a busted flush draw or something like that. Secondly, if I check, he's almost surely going to check behind a hand like ace-jack. If worse aces are in his range, like ace-8 or ace-7, they're probably not in his range. But if they are, those hands will certainly check back as well. And if he does have a hand like king-queen, again, probably not too likely, but that'll almost surely check back too. So by betting here, I can get some value from from some of those hands. I mean, probably most of them will fold, but I think most people at these stakes would call with probably any ace if they had it. Ace jack, almost surely. And also, I avoid getting bluffed out once in a while. So I like to bet for both those reasons. And I just decided to go ahead and bet out here. On table number 2, again, a total blank came on the river, and he bet around half the pot. And now I think it's a pretty easy call. I really thought a long time about it, and I finally did decide to call. But I think I should have called this quite a bit quicker, because all of his bet sizing really points to him not having a big hand here. So I'd like to see myself call this bet a little bit quicker. You can kind of see the tortured thinking here. That's kind of funny. My opponent on table number 3 had a set of 5s and went into the tank and finally just decided to call. And I think that was an example of pretty poor hand reading on his part, because the only hand that beats him is a higher set or a king jack. And I mean, if I had one of those hands, I wouldn't check call $1 on the turn. So I mean, I think he really missed a lot of value by not raising there. I mean, granted, I wouldn't have called, but I mean, with my hand, I think most people would, and it was really kind of a clear situation where he should have went for value. On table number 2, he did have the busted flush draw. So I think that hand worked out pretty well for me. So, yeah, getting back to the point I was talking about earlier, you've kind of got a situation where very often you're going to be in the blinds. The cutoff or button is going to open against you. And it's going to be up to you with like a half decent hand, like a pocket pair, suited Broadway type hand, or something along those lines, to decide if you want to 3-bet or if you want to cold call. And I think in general, you're usually going to be better off 3-betting in that situation. Most people don't 3-bet nearly enough in that situation there. And I feel like at a minimum, you should be 3-betting around 9% of the time or around 10% of the time versus those late position openers. And if you think they'll fold a lot, you should probably be doing it even more. The ace-9 on table number 4, I think, is a pretty easy isolation raise. You've got a very loose player, so you kind of clearly want to try to punish him a little for all of those limps. And plus, you're going to have position in his hand. And this particular spot on the 7-jack-6 flop, I just decided to give up. I don't like to go too crazy against those loose players and try to bluff them too often. I think when the flop comes something like jack-7-6, if they're loose passive and you have a decent showdown value hand, like an ace-high, most of the time you're better off just checking that sort of hand back, because against a passive player, if your hand is good, they'll very often just check it down with you. They won't like take your check as the white flag and start attacking you just because you checked. So I figure, why waste the continuation bet if I'm behind there? On table number 4, now I pick up the ace-7 suited. So I flop 2 overs plus an open-ended straight draw and decide to bet out into 2 people. When 2 people call me, I rarely get too carried away. So I just kind of decide to give up at that point there. The ace-queen, I think, is a pretty standard defense against the 3-bet on table number 3. But the flop comes very badly, and he makes a decent-sized c-bet. So there's not really too much I can do about it. So on table number 4, it ends up that the Fisher-type player kind of ends up having a big hand, and the other player was kind of trying to pull off a bluff. So on table number 4, now I get the ace-9 of hearts, and there's 2 kind of interesting hands here. One happens on table number 1 with the pocket 3s against the button open. One thing I like to do a lot, and I'll get into this a little later on, is I do like to sometimes 3-bet small pairs from out of the blinds against certain people. Uh, Usually they don't play too well if your opponent's loose. Like if your opponent's going to call your 3-bet a lot, it's not a good idea to 3-bet with a small pair. But if your opponent folds a lot to 3-bets, let's say you look at his fold to 3-bet number and it's higher than 60%, then I think that you'll do better 3-betting with your small pair than you will folding. And I don't like cold calling with small pairs out of the blinds because against wide ranges, they just don't do very well out of position. So usually I'll either 3-bet or fold, and I'll 3-bet the tighter players very often, and against the looser ones, I just end up folding. I also like to try to punish these late position openers who are short stacks. A lot of them open the button an absurd amount of the time, like 80% of the time or 90% of the time. So if I'm up against one of those guys, I'm just going to 3-bet very liberally and just try to take it down. And in this case, I am thinking forever for some reason. But I do eventually end up 3-betting. That might be like a little internet hiccup or something like that. I'm not really sure. Yeah, okay, it's definitely a little internet hiccup. Sometimes the internet connection here in Budapest isn't the best. The flop comes really great with the 2 overs and the nut flush draw. So obviously against his stack size, I'm getting it in. And it's just a question of how best to do it. I think that against his particular stack size, probably a very large flop bet intending to call off would be the best way to go. A check raise is what I ended up doing. The thing about the check raise is that with his stack size, if he bets very large on the flop, like let's say he pots it, then I just don't have any fold equity. So I'm still going to go all in, of course, but at that point, even if he's bluffing, I've kind of priced him in with hands like ace high. So I think that the bet call would have been a little bit better, but the check raise is certainly not bad, and actually it worked out a little bit better because he picked a small bet size with air, and I ended up capturing that little bluff bet that he made. But yeah, the thing I wanted to get into, which I think is pretty important, is kind of the idea of constructing a 3-betting range from the blinds versus late position opens. This is something I've thought a little bit about, and I kind of wanted to go into a little bit of theory about like what sort of hands I think are good to do that with, and what sort of hands are maybe better to cold call with. So let me take a brief little break here, and I'd like to just go into my database and kind of present a little presentation about that. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to have a little presentation on the reasons why you should incorporate light 3-betting as a part of your game. So by light 3-betting, I would mean 3-betting any hand other than ace king or pocket tens or better. So let's say you're playing a 25 no limit game, and your opponent on the button opens to 75 cents. And now you're in the big blind, the small blind is folded, and you have to decide if you want to 3-bet. So let's say you're going to 3-bet to $2.50 is one option, and another option is that you can just cold call the open and just see the flop. So the first question that comes up is, why should you prefer to light 3-bet certain hands as opposed to cold calling in that situation? And I would say that really a better question than that is, why would you ever cold call in that situation, because for the most part, just about any hand you can name is going to do better for a 3-bet in that spot against typical opponents than it will do for a cold call. And just to show you what I'm talking about, I've taken a bunch of hands from my own database, and this database is mostly from hands played at 25 no limit, 50 no limit, and 100 no limit. But what I've done is I've converted all the results to what they would be in a 25 no limit game. So the different types of hands are on the left. You have suited aces, ace deuce or ace nine suited. You have suited Broadway, and that includes all the suited Broadways with the exception of ace king or ace queen suited. Medium pairs, 7s through 9s. Small pairs, deuces through 6s. Suited connectors, and that's 10-9 suited down through 5-4 suited. And the offsuit Broadways. And the offsuit Broadways are mostly ace jack and king queen. Again, ace king and ace queen I don't count. Those are kind of their own separate category, obviously. And there's a few trials with king jack in there, but mostly I fold king jack in that situation. So most of the trials for the offsuit Broadway are ace jack and king queen offsuit. And the first column shows you what the expectation of the hand would be if you folded. You'd just be giving up your big blind, so you'd lose 25 cents on the hand. The second column shows the results that I've had for cold calling, both the number of times I've cold called and my average amount won or lost per hand. And the fourth and fifth columns show my results for 3-betting, the number of times I've tried 3-betting the hand, and my average result per hand. So you can see with almost every single hand or hand type in this chart, I'm doing better if I 3-bet than I'm doing if I cold call. So to me, cold calling is more of a thing that you do because you're up against a specific opponent type. For instance, let's say it's an opponent who 4-bets a lot. Like if you 3-bet him, he's going to 4-bet you around 20% of the time. Well, then cold calling is a much more viable strategy. Now, hopefully at micro stakes you don't meet too many opponents like that, because opponents like that definitely aren't too much fun to play against, and they're not very profitable to play against either. But most of your opponents, of course, aren't going to be so aggressive. So I think that in general, light 3-betting should definitely be a big part of your game. Now, let's go ahead and talk about what is perhaps holding people back from light 3-betting, which is their fear that if they 3-bet without a really good hand, that their opponent will somehow figure out what they're doing and will just 4-bet as a bluff and make them fold. So let's look at what could happen in that scenario. Let's say that you decide to 3-bet 8.9% of hands, and that would be the hands you see on the left-hand panel. And let's say of those 8.9% of hands that you're 3-betting, you're going to fold 5.4% of them. And those would be the hands you see in the right-hand panel. The other hands, the 10s or better and the ace-king, if your opponent 4-bets any of those hands, you intend to simply 5-bet all in. And that's really a subject for a separate video, I think, where we can talk about why those hands are the ones that are safe to 5-bet all in. But I can just tell you, based on my experience at these stakes, against almost all opponents, that's a pretty safe range to 5-bet all in right there. So what you can see if you run the math is that if we 3-bet 8.9% of our hands and our opponent decided to 4-bet bluff us, our opponent's 4-bet bluff would work 60.7% of the time. So let's go ahead and see if that would be enough for our opponent to show a profit by 4-bet bluffing us. So if our opponent opened to 75 cents, we 3-bet the big blind to $2.50, and then let's say he 4-bet bluffs us to $6, hoping that we will fold. So let's calculate the percentage of the time that the opponent's 4-bet bluff would have to work to show a profit. So to do that, you would take the amount he's risking, which is $5.25. That's the $5.25 on top of the 75 cents he originally opened to. And you divide that by the amount risked plus the money in the pot. and the money in the pot would be $3.35. That would be his original 75 cents, the 10 cents of the small blind, and the $2.50 that we use to 3-bet. And this formula you can pretty much use whenever you're trying to figure out whether or not any bluff is going to be profitable. It's a general formula, but in this case, just plugging in the numbers, we get that the opponent's 4-bet bluff would have to work 61.1% of the time to show a profit. But jumping back to the previous slide, you see that he would only succeed with his bluff 60.7% of the time. So he wouldn't succeed quite enough to show a profit. So what you can see from this is that you can 3-bet a fair amount of light hands and still be unexploitable in the sense that your opponent can't really show a profit by 4-bet bluffing you. So let's go ahead and take a look at the overall expectation of 3-betting light. So the general formula you'd use, and I encourage you to just kind of play around with this formula and try to figure out which opponents would be profitable to 3-bet light against and which opponents would not be. But the general formula is just going to be the percent they fold to the 3-bet times the amount you win when they do fold, which would be the amount they open to, 75 cents in our example, plus the small blinds, 10 cents. And then you'd add to that the percentage of the time they call the 3-bet and multiply by the expected value when they call the 3-bet. And then you'd subtract by the percentage of the time they 4-bet and multiplied by $2.50, which is the amount you'd lose when your light 3-bet didn't work out. So what I've done is I've plugged in some example numbers from my database, and these numbers are the averages that I've had my 3-bet folded to, that I've had my 3-bet called, and that I've had my 3-bet 4-bet. And in my database, the average numbers were people folded to the 3-bet 60% of the time, they called it 29% of the time, and they 4-bet 11% of the time. So overall, what I found is that against this sort of typical opponent, my 3-bet is profitable when my hand loses on average less than 81 cents when it gets called. And let's look at how some typical hands do when you light 3-bet and get called. But you're going to see in the next slide that these hands are all doing much better than losing 81 cents on average. So here are some typical hand results from my database, and you can see the number of trials and the amount that they lose on average when the opponent flat calls. And you can see none of these hands are losing anywhere near 81 cents on average. So overall, the point you want to take away from this is that against most opponents, light 3-betting should be an important part of your arsenal, and it really adds a lot of profit to your game. And there are certain opponents, if you play with the equation on the previous slide, who 4-bet a great deal, who light 3-betting is not as profitable against. So if you toy with the equation, you'll see that if they start to 4-bet you a lot, like 18%, 19%, 20%, light 3-betting can lose a lot of its value. But again, I don't think you'll run into too many opponents like that. So let's go ahead and look at an example of how a typical opponent might play. We'll just take an example opponent and what sort of hands we would want to 3-bet against that type of opponent. So the first opponent I'd like to discuss is an opponent who opens the button 40% of the time and who folds to a 3-bet a great deal of the time. An opponent who folds to the 3-bet around 75% of the time. So this is a very tight opponent. Now, let's also say that this opponent plays fairly straightforwardly on the flop, that they don't bluff raise a lot on the flop, that they don't float a lot. If they miss, they just tend to give up to a continuation bet usually. What sort of hands would we want to 3-bet against that type of opponent? And my suggestion would be something like the hands and the right hand slide. It would be 13.6% of hands. And it's definitely an exploitable 3-betting range. If your opponent knew what you were doing and knew that you were 3-betting this many hands, he could start to 4-bet bluff you. He could do some things to exploit you. But you're not going totally crazy. You're only going slightly beyond a range that would be unexploitable. And since your opponent is a tight opponent, chances are he's not going to alter his game or figure out what you're doing and start punishing what you're doing. The trick to a lot of situations in poker when you're dealing with tight opponents is to figure out just how much you can lean on them, just how much pressure you can put on them, so that they don't cross that point where they just snap and go crazy and start playing back at you a lot more. So I think this range is a pretty safe range to use against them. It includes all the good value hands, tens or better, and ace king, ace queen, ace jack. And then it also includes a lot of good light 3-betting hands. For instance, it includes the small pairs, deuces through sixes. And I really like those hands for light 3-betting against this particular type of opponent. Now, a lot of people say that you should not use these hands for light 3-betting because they miss the flop so often. But against a tight, predictable opponent, I feel that there's a lot of good things that can happen on the flop. First of all, the flop can come ace high, and we can just continuation bet. And most of the time, our opponent's not going to have an ace and fold. Secondly, the flop can come king high. If you look at the villain's flat calling range for calling our 3-bet, it contains very few hands with a king. So if the flop comes king high, we can simply go ahead and continuation bet the flop. We'll fold out all of his air. And if he calls us with his pocket pairs lower than a king, we can simply follow up with a second barrel on the turn. And that should fold out all of those hands. So on a king high flop, we should be in very good shape to get him to fold if we just follow up with 2 barrels. Also, we can always hit our set, and that's going to happen 11.8% of the time. Plus, if we get to see the turn card, a little more than that. And finally, a pretty dry flop can come, a flop like Jack 5 deuce. And if a flop like that comes, again, we should have a good chance of taking it down to the continuation bet. The only flops we really hate to see are the ones that are dominated by middle cards, like cards 8 through queen. And those cards, those times we can mostly just check fold. And since our opponent is passive, once in a while, we might be surprised when he lets us see a free showdown, and we win anyways. And I think the suited connectors are also good for light 3-betting against this type of opponent. The plan is basically the same as it is with the small pairs, which is to try to take it down with bluffs on ace high, king high boards, and dry boards, and to once in a while make a big hand. So that's how I would try to handle this type of opponent. Now let's go ahead and look at a different type of opponent. This opponent also opens 40% of hands on the button. However, this particular opponent only folds to a 3-bet around 40% of the time. So this opponent is just going to see the flop with us quite a bit. Now, if you're up against this sort of opponent, and let's also say, just to kind of broaden the discussion, that it's an opponent who likes to float and likes to bluff raise once in a while. Against this type of opponent, what you want to do is you want to 3-bet mostly big cards. And if you looked on like some poker strategy forums and so forth, you probably seen a little bit of this sort of theory put out there. They call this range that is mostly based on big cards a merged 3-bet range. And the idea with this 3-betting range is that you want to go ahead and make top pair or better, and then simply bet the flop and bet the turn and bet all in on the river. And you're hoping that your opponent will call you down with a worse hand or bluff raise you at some point. So let's say, for instance, you have ace jack. If the flop comes something like jack 7 deuce, now since your opponent is calling your 3-bet with so many hands, your ace jack is probably going to end up stacking his king jack, his queen jack, his Jack 10 suited, is Jack 9 suited, is Jack 8 suited. And also, you're going to get at least one street of action from hands like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, probably all his 7x's. And you might even get two streets of action from those hands. So you'd just be in very good shape with your top pair, top kicker type of hand. And as an alternative, what you could do with this type of hand is you could bet the flop and then chuck raise the turn to go ahead and take advantage of his floats. So against this type of opponent, you'd be using this type of 3-betting range. So I would encourage you just to go ahead and try to come up with some other examples of opponent types and just think a little bit about what sort of light 3-betting strategy you would want to use against those specific opponent types. Okay, so let's get back to the live play now.